Snow had been falling over Sudbury since before dawn, and Callum Reid hadn't slept. He at the kitchen table with his laptop open, the cursor blinking inside an email he'd been trying to finish for the past 40 minutes. Outside, the streetlights turned the falling snow orange. Inside, the only other light came from the hallway nightlight, the one shaped like a little bear that his daughter Nora had picked out herself at the dollar store 2 Christmases ago, when she still thought dollar stores were magical places where anything was possible. 11 years. That was how long Callum had worked at Northline Logistics. 11 years of early starts and missed dinners, and driving 3 hours round trip to the depot in weather that had no business putting anyone on the road. 11 years of being the person they called when a route needed covering, when a driver called in sick, when the books didn't balance and someone needed to stay late and figure out why. He had been reliable in the way that quiet people are reliable. Not because anyone noticed, but because the work kept getting done. He pressed send before he could change his mind again. The resignation sat in his outbox for 3 seconds before it disappeared. Callum closed the laptop slowly, like he was closing something that couldn't be reopened. He listened to the apartment, the hiss of the radiator, the wind pushing against the windows, and from down the hall, barely audible, the soft breathing of a 7-year-old girl who had no idea what her father had just done. Nora had been diagnosed with juvenile idiopathic arthritis 8 months ago. The name was clinical and long and meant almost nothing to Callum the first time the rheumatologist said it. What it meant in practice was this. Some mornings, Nora's hands hurt so badly she couldn't hold a pencil. Some mornings she couldn't open her own cereal box. Mornings she cried before she even got out of bed, not because she was dramatic. Nora was the least dramatic child he had ever known, but because her body simply hurt and she didn't know what else to do. The medication helped. The physiotherapy appointments helped. But both cost money that Callum's benefits plan covered only partially, and the appointments were always in the afternoon, during work hours, and Northline had been patient for exactly as long as it served them to be patient. 3 weeks ago, his supervisor Glenn had pulled him aside in the break room and told him, with the particular kindness that isn't kindness at all, that they needed someone who could commit to a full schedule. "You're a great worker, Callum. You know we think the world of you. But we need someone consistent." Callum had nodded and said he understood and gone back to his desk and sat there for an hour without doing anything. He had tried to make it work after that. He'd rearranged Nora's appointments, traded Thursdays with another driver, asked his neighbor Patricia if she could do pickup on the days he ran late. Patricia was 71 and arthritic herself and said yes without hesitating, which made everything worse somehow. Then, last Tuesday, Nora had a flare-up at school. The teacher called at 10 a.m. Callum had a delivery run scheduled that couldn't be reassigned. He'd sat in the depot parking lot for 6 minutes, trying to figure out which obligation he could abandon, and in those 6 minutes something had calcified inside him that hadn't been soft to begin with. He drove to the school. He picked up Nora. She was sitting outside the nurse's office with her coat already on, her backpack on her lap, both hands curled in her lap like small birds trying to keep warm. She looked up when she saw him and didn't say anything. She just reached up with those sore hands and waited for him to take them. That night, after she'd fallen asleep with a heat pack wrapped around her wrists, Callum had sat at the kitchen table and thought about the word consistent. He thought about what it meant that 11 years of showing up had been quietly reclassified as inconsistency. The moment showing up started to cost the company something. He thought about Nora asking him once, on a night when he'd come home after she was already asleep, whether he had to work forever. She hadn't cried when she asked it. She'd been eating toast at the breakfast table the next morning, very focused on the butter, and she said it the way children say things they've been thinking about for a long time. Whether he had to work forever. Like the possibility that he might stop had never quite seemed real to her. He sent the resignation at 4:17 in the morning. By 8 a.m., he'd told Nora that things were going to be a little different for a while. She'd looked at him over her orange juice and asked if different meant she'd have to move schools. He said he didn't think so. She seemed to accept that and went back to her toast. He walked her to school in the snow. He came home and made a list of what he had in savings, and what he owed and how long one could realistically last against the other. The math was not encouraging. He had maybe 8 weeks before the numbers became a genuine emergency. Assuming nothing unexpected happened with Nora's health, assuming the car held together, assuming the landlord didn't raise the rent again. He started applying to jobs that afternoon. The first 2 weeks were almost manageable. He fell into a routine. Applications in the mornings while Nora was at school, pick up at 3, physio appointments on Wednesdays, groceries on Fridays, with whatever was left of the budget after the pharmacy. He cooked more. He slept less. He told himself this was temporary. By the 3rd week, the rejections had started arriving. Not dramatic rejections. Just silence, mostly, the kind that means you were never seriously considered. A few automated emails thanking him for his interest. One phone interview that had gone well until the interviewer asked about his availability, and Callum had been honest about Nora's appointments, and he could hear the shift in the interviewer's voice before the call was even over. He sold his road bike. He canceled the streaming service. He started buying the store brand everything, which he'd been too proud to do before, which now seemed like an absurd thing to have had pride about. One afternoon, in early February, Nora found him at the kitchen table, with the bills spread out in front of him. She stood in the doorway in her socks and her school sweater, and looked at the papers with an expression too old for her face. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked. Callum looked at his daughter. The heat pack was around her left wrist. There was marker on her chin from an art project. She was 7 years old and she was asking him the question he'd been asking himself every night for 3 weeks. And she was asking it without drama, the same way she asked everything. Because Nora had learned very young that there was no point making things louder than they already were. "We're going to figure it out," he said. She nodded, like that was enough for her, and went back to her room. That was the worst part. That she believed him. The hydro bill arrived the following Friday. Callum had been expecting it but not the amount, higher than usual. Because February in Northern Ontario is not a month that allows you to keep the heat low, he did the math again. The math was the same. He called the hydro company and was put on hold for 40 minutes and told he could apply for an extension if he submitted documentation. Which he did, and which bought him 3 weeks. He started taking on small jobs. A neighbor needed someone to clear the ice from their driveway after a storm. A woman down the street needed furniture moved. It wasn't much, but it was something. He didn't mention any of it to Nora. On a Thursday evening in late February, the power went out. It wasn't dramatic. The lights simply stopped, the way lights do when the company makes good on what the letters have been warning. The apartment went dark and quiet, except for the sound of Nora in the living room, who had been drawing at the coffee table, and who now called out his name in a voice that was very carefully not scared. "Dad." "I know," he said. "Give me a minute." He found the emergency candles in the hall closet, left over from a camping trip he and Nora had taken 2 summers ago, before the diagnosis, before everything, and set 3 of them on the kitchen table. The apartment turned amber and close. Nora came and sat across from him and looked at the candles. "Did we forget to pay?" she asked. "I'm going to fix it," he said. She picked up her pencil and kept drawing. A horse, he thought. She was always drawing horses. He watched her bent over the paper in the candlelight, her sore wrist resting lightly on the table, her face absolutely serious about the horse, and something in his chest pulled so tight he had to look away. There was a knock at the door. He assumed it was Patricia from upstairs, coming to check on them. He stood up, pushed his chair back, walked to the door, and opened it. The woman, standing in the hallway, was not Patricia. She was in her mid-40s, in a dark coat with snow still on the shoulders, and beside her stood a boy of about 9 who was looking at his shoes. Callum recognized her face in the way you recognize someone you've seen in photographs rather than in person. That half-second delay between seeing and understanding. Her name was Sylvia Marchetti. She was the Chief Operations Officer of Northline Logistics. He had seen her photograph on the company website, and once, briefly, at an all-staff meeting 3 years ago, seated at the front of a room while someone else gave the presentation. She was the 3rd most powerful person in a company that moved freight across 6 provinces. She was standing outside his apartment in Sudbury with snow on her coat and an unreadable expression. And Callum had absolutely no idea what to say. "Mr. Reid," she said, "I'm sorry to come without calling. I wasn't sure you'd answer." He stared at her. "How did you?" "HR has the address on file." She paused. "I know how that sounds. I'm not here on behalf of the company." Her eyes moved briefly into the apartment, to the candles on the table, to Nora still bent over her drawing. Something crossed her face that was quick and difficult to name. "May I come in?" He stepped back without entirely deciding to. Sylvia came in slowly, the way people do when they're aware they're entering something fragile. Her son stayed close beside her, still looking at his shoes. She looked around the apartment. the candles, the bills on the counter that Callum hadn't gotten around to putting away, Nora's drawings taped in an uneven row along the hallway wall, horses and dogs, and one very ambitious attempt at a wolf. She stood there taking it in with an expression that kept shifting between things he couldn't name. "This is my son Declan," she said. He looked up briefly. Callum said hello. Nora had appeared in the kitchen doorway, curious and cautious. "Your resignation letter," Sylvia said, turning back to Callum. "I read it." He hadn't written much. Just the facts, the date, his name, a single paragraph explaining that his daughter's medical needs required him to be present in a way his position no longer allowed. He hadn't been angry in it, he hadn't tried to be. "Most resignation letters from employees like you say nothing," Sylvia said. "They say I am resigning effective the following date and that's it. You explained why." She paused. "I needed to know why." Callum waited. She sat down at the kitchen table without being invited. He noticed she did it carefully, like she wasn't sure she had the right. Declan sat beside her. Nora drifted into the room and stood near Callum, close enough that her shoulder touched his arm. "I had a meeting in Sudbury yesterday," Sylvia said. "I was still here this morning. I've been sitting in my hotel room for most of the day trying to decide whether to come." She looked at her hands. "My husband and I separated 2 years ago. Declan lives with me full-time. Last year his school called and I was in Vancouver. I took the next flight back and I made it in time, but it was close, and the whole way home I kept thinking about what it would mean if I hadn't, what it would have meant to him. What it already meant to him, all those times I made it but only barely." She stopped. "I don't tell you this to make it about me. I tell you because when I read your letter I understood what you were actually saying. Not the version companies want to hear." Callum looked at Nora, who was listening with the particular attention she gave to things she felt were important. She met his eyes. He looked back at Sylvia. "You have a real problem," Sylvia said. "Not just the immediate one. You're in a field that doesn't have room for people whose lives look like yours, and you're not the only one. There are people at Northline right now, good workers, reliable people, who are one sick kid call away from the same decision you made, and we act like that's their problem to solve. Like it's a scheduling issue." Her voice had gone quiet but not soft. "It isn't, it's a policy failure, and I'm tired of pretending otherwise." She reached into her bag and set a folder on the table. The candles made the light move. "I've been drafting a proposal for 6 months," she said. "A caregiver accommodation policy. Flexible scheduling, remote options where roles allow, emergency leave with pay for parents of children with medical needs. I have the data. I have a pilot structure. What I haven't had is a reason to push it past the executive team, because every time I bring it up someone says we need to see proof of concept." She tapped the folder. "I want to run the pilot out of the Sudbury depot, and I want you to be part of shaping it. Not as a driver, unless that's what you want. As someone who can speak to what this actually looks like from the inside." Callum didn't move for a moment. He looked at the folder. He looked at Sylvia. "Why me?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Because you didn't yell in your resignation letter," she said. "Because you explained it clearly and without bitterness, and that told me more about your judgment than 11 years of performance reviews." She glanced at Nora. "And because someone should have made this easier for you a long time ago." The candles threw soft light across the table. Declan had pulled a small handheld game out of his jacket pocket and was looking at Nora with the cautious assessment children give each other when they're deciding whether to bother making friends. Nora looked back at him. "Do you want to see my drawings?" she said. He looked up. "What kind?" "Horses mostly, some wolves." He put the game in his pocket. Callum opened the folder. The proposal was thorough. Clearly the work of someone who had been thinking about this for a long time and hadn't been given a proper place to put it. He read the first page slowly, then the second. When he looked up, Sylvia was watching him with the careful attention of someone who is very good at reading people but has learned not to show it. "The medical coverage," he said. "For children with ongoing conditions. Is that actually in here?" "Page 4, she said. "Comprehensive, physio, medication specialist visits." He turned to page 4. A handwritten note was at the bottom, below the formal print. He almost missed it. Her handwriting was small and slanted slightly to the right. "No one who shows up the way you showed up should have to choose between being a parent and being employed. This policy is long overdue. I'd rather build it with someone who knows what it costs to need it." Callum set the folder down. Outside, the snow had stopped. The street was very quiet. In the other room, Nora was explaining to Declan, with great seriousness, the structural differences between a canter and a gallop, and Declan was asking questions that suggested he was actually interested. Or was at least a polite enough kid to pretend. Callum thought about the morning he'd picked Nora up from school, her hands in her lap, her coat already on, the way she'd reached up without saying anything, because she'd learned not to ask for too much. There are other parents in this situation, he said, not just at Northline. The policy would have to be scalable, Sylvia said. Yes, that's the intention. The Sudbury pilot is the proof of concept. If it works, it rolls out across all depots within 18 months. That's in the document. Okay. He nodded slowly. The position I'm offering is temporary to start, she said. 3 months while the pilot is developed. After that, if the executive team approves, which I believe they will, it becomes permanent. Policy coordinator, caregiver programs. Work from here, go into the depot when needed. Nora's appointments stay Nora's appointments. Callum looked around his kitchen. The candles, the bills, the wolves and horses on the wall. He had been afraid for months. Not the loud kind of afraid that you can name and move through, but the quiet kind. The kind that lives in the back of your chest while you keep doing the next necessary thing, because the next necessary thing has to get done regardless of what you feel about it. It didn't disappear entirely. He didn't imagine it would. But it got smaller, right there in the candlelight, with Sylvia Marchetti sitting at his kitchen table and Nora's voice carrying down the hallway, explaining the finer points of horse anatomy to a boy from Vancouver, who hadn't expected to learn anything that day. Okay, Callum said. Sylvia nodded once, not triumphant, just settled, the way a decision looks when it's the right one. They called the hydro company together that night, Sylvia speaking in the particular register of someone who is used to being taken seriously, and by 9 o'clock the power was back on. Nora stood in the kitchen when the lights came on and made a sound of quiet satisfaction, like she had never doubted this was how it would go. Later, after Sylvia and Declan had left and Nora was in bed, Callum sat at the kitchen table with the proposal open in front of him. He read through it slowly, the whole thing, making small notes in the margins. There was a lot of work still to do. There were people at every depot who needed something like this and had been managing without it. Quietly, the way he had been managing. Canceling the streaming service, buying the store brand everything. Asking the 71-year-old neighbor for help and feeling terrible about it. Because she always said yes. He thought about Nora, asking if they were going to be okay, in her socks and her school sweater with the marker on her chin. He thought about the word consistent, and what it had meant to the people who'd used it against him, and what it was going to mean now. He closed the folder. He turned off the kitchen light. He walked down the hall past the bear-shaped nightlight, past the horses and wolves marching in their uneven row, and he stopped at Nora's door and listened to her sleep. She was breathing slowly and easily. Her hands resting on top of the blanket were uncurled, open, the way hands look when nothing hurts. He stood there for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he went to bed, and for the first time in months, so did the fear. I keep thinking about Nora's hands. The way they were resting on top of the blanket at the end. Open, uncurled, relaxed in sleep. That image stays with me more than anything else in Callum's story, because those hands had been the whole reason any of it began. When Callum picked her up from school that Tuesday, Nora didn't cry or complain. She just sat there with her coat already on, her sore hands folded in her lap, waiting. She had already learned, at 7 years old, not to expect too much. That kind of quiet acceptance in a child isn't peace, it's resignation. And something about seeing it broke through every practical calculation Callum had been running in his head for months. That moment mattered because he let it matter. That's the part I think about most. He could have filed it away, told himself he'd figure something out, kept going. A lot of people do. Instead, he went home and sent an email at 4 in the morning, and that single act of moral clarity, choosing his daughter over his fear, set everything else in motion. There's a version of this story where Callum is simply lucky. The right executive happened to read his letter. The right person happened to already have a half-finished proposal sitting in a folder. But I don't think luck is quite the right word for what happened. What Callum did was write an honest letter. Not an angry one, not a strategic one. Just an honest account of what his life actually looked like, and why he couldn't keep pretending otherwise. That kind of integrity tends to reach people, even people you'd expect it not to reach. It reached Sylvia. Not because she was already good, but because she was already paying attention. Already carrying her own version of the same weight. And Callum's words gave her something to push against. The resilience piece is what I find hardest to talk about. Because Callum's version of resilience doesn't look like strength in the conventional sense. He sold his road bike. He bought store-brand everything. He asked a 71-year-old neighbor for help and felt terrible about it. He sat at a kitchen table with bills spread in front of him, while his daughter stood in the doorway asking if they were going to be okay. That's not a montage of someone powering through. That's someone doing the next necessary thing while being genuinely afraid. And doing it anyway, day after day, without knowing how it ends. What strikes me is how those three things, doing right by the people who depend on you, thinking clearly under pressure, and continuing to move when you have every reason to stop, aren't separate qualities in Callum's story. They're the same quality, showing up in different rooms. The integrity he showed in his resignation letter is the same thing that kept him making lunches and attending physio appointments, and not giving up on job applications even when the silence from employers felt like an answer. The courage was never dramatic. It was just consistent. And Nora's hands open in sleep at the end. That's what consistent courage looks like when it finally gets to rest.